The sun had barely risen, casting a golden glow over the quiet streets. The city was waking up, the distant hum of cars and the faint melody of birds filling the air. Inside the bus depot, an aging but well-kept Route 27 bus stood waiting. It had carried thousands of passengers over the years, but today it carried a story worth remembering. Sitting in the driver's seat was Roger Schwartz, 65 years old, a tall man with slightly stooped shoulders, silver-streaked hair, and kind brown eyes that had witnessed decades of change. His hands, rough from years of gripping the wheel, traced the edges of his well-worn uniform. A crisp blue shirt with a brass City Transit badge pinned neatly on the chest. Today wasn't just another day. Today was his last ride. 30 years. 30 years of sunrises and sunsets, of familiar faces boarding his bus, of driving the same route through neighborhoods that had grown and changed before his eyes. He had watched children turn into adults, students become professionals, and morning commuters age alongside him. This wasn't just a bus route, it was a lifetime of memories. He took a deep breath, adjusting his cap. His fingers hovered over the ignition key, hesitating for just a second longer than usual. Something felt different today. A glance in the rearview mirror. The usual passengers were there. Mrs. Harris, the elderly woman who always sat in the third row and knitted during the ride. DeAndre, the teenager with his headphones on, nodding to the rhythm of music only he could hear. Mr. Patel, the middle-aged accountant who always double-checked his briefcase before stepping off at Fifth Avenue. They were all here, just like they always were. But something was off. They were all smiling at him. A knowing, expectant kind of smile. A warmth that filled the bus in a way he couldn't quite place. Roger furrowed his brow slightly, shifting in his seat. And then, out of the corner of his eye, he noticed something. A small, folded piece of paper taped to the fare box, his name scrawled across the front in bold black ink. His heart gave a strange, unexpected flutter. Slowly, he reached for it, peeling it off the metal surface. The paper felt slightly worn under his fingertips, as if it had been passed between hands before arriving here. He unfolded it carefully, and the words inside made his breath catch. "Roger, don't be late today. We have a surprise for you. Your morning crew." His grip tightened around the note. A surprise? For him? He had expected today to be like any other, maybe with a simple handshake from his supervisor at the end of a shift. But this was different. What were they planning? His pulse quickened slightly, but he forced a smile, clearing his throat. Whatever it was, he'd find out soon enough. With a final glance at his passengers, now watching him with quiet anticipation, he turned the key in the ignition. The bus rumbled to life. The last journey had begun. The bus rolled out of the depot, merging onto the familiar streets. The early morning sun spilled across the windshield, casting a golden glow on the road ahead. Roger Schwartz, 65, his neatly pressed blue uniform hugging his broad frame, sat tall in his seat, his silver-streaked hair catching the light as he focused on the road. His hands, calloused, steady, weathered by decades of driving, gripped the wheel with a sense of routine, yet his mind was anything but calm. What could they possibly have planned? For 30 years, this route had been his second home. The same winding streets, the same intersections, the same passengers, all part of his everyday rhythm. He knew every stop, every pothole, every moment of traffic where he needed to tap the brakes a second earlier. But today, there was a weight in his chest, an anticipation that made each familiar turn feel new. Ding! First stop. The doors hissed open, and Mrs. Harris, the frail yet feisty elderly woman who always sat in the third row, shuffled aboard. Her wrinkled hands clutched a knitted shawl draped over her shoulders, her gray curls neatly pinned back. She gave Roger a long look, a look that said more than words ever could. "Morning, Roger," she said softly, her voice carrying an unusual warmth. "Morning, Mrs. Harris," he replied, tipping his cap as she moved to her usual seat. Next stop, Market Street. A young woman in a red coat stepped aboard. Jenna Kahn, 28, a barista who always boarded at this very stop. Her dark brown hair framed her bright hazel eyes, and she carried the same oversized to-go coffee cup Roger had seen for years. But today, she didn't just hand over her fare. She hesitated, staring at him with a small smile before slipping something into the fare box. A folded note. Roger blinked, but before he could say anything, she simply winked. What was going on? Stop after stop. Familiar faces climbed aboard. DeAndre, the teenager who always had his headphones on, gave Roger a knowing nod. Mr. Patel, the accountant, clutched his briefcase a little tighter, his face unreadable. Chelsea Boyer, a school teacher in her mid-40s with her wavy auburn hair neatly pinned back, glanced at Roger with a soft, almost nostalgic expression. Every single one of them left something in the fare box. His grip on the wheel tightened, his heart beat just a little faster. At the next red light, he peeked inside. It wasn't just one note, there were several, neatly folded, carefully placed. Some were written on lined notebook paper, others on scraps of receipts, and a few on decorative stationery. Roger swallowed hard. He wanted to open them. He wanted to know what was inside, but he was still on duty. The road came first. Stay focused, Roger. The route isn't done yet. He took a deep breath, pushed down the strange mixture of excitement and apprehension, and pressed on the accelerator. As he turned onto Lincoln Avenue, something caught his eye. A banner. A massive, bright-colored banner stretched across the sidewalk ahead, but he couldn't quite make out the words. The bus was still a few stops away from where it hung, but in his gut, he knew it was for him. What was waiting at the final stop? The engine hummed as Roger navigated the next turn. His hands, steady as always, now felt heavier on the wheel. The neatly folded papers in the fare box seemed to radiate an invisible energy, tugging at his thoughts. What's in those notes? He took a deep breath, reminding himself to focus on the road. But today wasn't just another day. It was the final ride after 30 years of dedication, a ride filled with secrets waiting to unfold. Ding! Another stop. The bus doors whooshed open, and Javier Bonner, a middle-aged mechanic with grease-stained hands, stepped inside. He usually kept to himself, a quiet nod his only greeting. But today, he stopped at the front. He placed his rough hand on Roger's shoulder, gave a firm squeeze, and met his eyes. Thanks for everything, Roger. Roger blinked. Yeah, of course. Javier walked to his seat without another word. The air inside the bus felt different. A quiet electricity pulsed through the space. It wasn't just another route. Something was happening. The notes. Roger glanced at them again at the next red light. His pulse quickened. One was scrawled in crayon. A kid's handwriting. Another was in neat cursive. Elegant, practiced. Some were scribbled in a rush, barely legible. Heartfelt. Raw. You never knew, but you saved me from a terrible day. My son loves how you always honk twice when he waves. Thank you for making his mornings. I lost my job last year. You were the only person who made me feel like I still mattered. Roger's vision blurred. He swallowed hard. Next stop, downtown Plaza. A group of teenagers clambered aboard, laughing, pushing each other playfully. One of them, Hazel Myers, 17, with dark curls and bright, intelligent eyes, stepped forward and handed him something. A Polaroid photo. Roger hesitated, then took it. It was a picture of him, taken from behind the wheel. But in the background, reflected in the rearview mirror, was something he'd never noticed before. Passengers smiling, laughing, at ease. He looked up. Hazel grinned. I took that last year. Thought you should see what we see. Before he could respond, she hurried to her seat, her backpack bouncing against her shoulders. What we see? Ding. Next stop. The doors opened, and Rhonda Howard, 50, with her graying braids pulled into a bun, had stepped aboard. She was always in a rush, always balancing too many grocery bags. But today, she set them down for a second, reached into her purse, and pulled out a single white rose. She placed it gently on the dashboard. You probably don't remember, Roger, she said, voice thick with emotion, but years ago you waited for me at this stop when I was running late. No other driver ever did that. Roger tried to speak, but nothing came out. He could only nod as she smiled and took her seat. All these years, and I never knew. The bus rolled toward the final intersection. Ahead, the banner loomed closer. The words were now visible. Thank you, Roger. You made every ride special. The sight hit him like a wave. A crowd had gathered. The final stop wasn't just another stop today. It was something more. Roger's grip tightened on the wheel. His heart pounded as he approached the final stop, the banner stretching across the street like a bridge between the past and the present. Thank you, Roger. You made every ride special. The words blurred for a moment as tears welled in his eyes. Was this really for him? Ding! Final stop. The bus hissed as it came to a gentle halt. But before Roger could open the doors, he noticed something unusual. No one moved. Every passenger, young and old, sat still, their gazes locked onto him. Then, like a wave rolling through the bus, applause erupted. Roger blinked rapidly. What is all this? The doors opened, and the outside world came alive. A crowd had gathered, their faces beaming with warmth. Banners waved, balloons bobbed in the breeze, and cameras flashed. Right at the front stood Tony Mosley, 65, the district transit supervisor. He stepped forward with a grin, holding a framed certificate in his hands. "Roger Schwartz," Tony's voice boomed, "for 30 years you've been more than a bus driver. You've been a friend, a mentor, a light in people's days. And today, we celebrate you." Roger shook his head in disbelief. "You all did this for me?" Laughter rippled through the crowd. Chelsea Boyer, 35, a single mother with a toddler in her arms, stepped forward. "You never knew," she said, her voice thick with emotion, "but my son's first word was bus, because every morning when you waved at him, he'd squeal with joy." The little boy in her arms clapped his tiny hands, giggling. More people stepped forward. Each had a story, a memory, a moment that Roger had unknowingly gifted them. Velma Kirk, 72, frail but full of spirit, held up a faded bus ticket. "This was from the first time you ever drove me home. You don't remember, but I was lost that day, and you made sure I got back safe." Sandy Mason, 42, the coffee shop owner, handed him a thermos. "For years, you've been my first customer in the morning. This time, the coffee's on me." Jenna Kahn, 29, an artist, lifted a covered canvas. "I painted something for you," she said, flipping it around. It was Roger, smiling behind the wheel, the cityscape blurred behind him, the reflection of passengers' happy faces in the windshield. Roger's chest tightened. His whole life, he thought he was just doing his job, but he had been so much more. Then came the final surprise. Tony stepped closer, handing him an envelope. "Roger, we know you weren't planning on retiring just yet, but this is for you." Roger opened it, and his breath caught. Inside was a paid vacation ticket. "A trip," he whispered. "To anywhere you want," Tony said. "You've spent your whole life driving people to where they need to be. Now it's time for you to go somewhere for yourself." "I never expected this." The crowd cheered. The people who had been part of his daily routine, faces he had greeted, lives he had unknowingly touched, were here, celebrating him. Tears finally spilled over as he wiped his eyes. "I don't know what to say." Javier Bonner, the quiet mechanic, patted his shoulder. "Just say yes." Roger chuckled, his heart full. For the first time in years, he had no route to follow, no schedule to keep. Maybe, just maybe, it's time for a new journey. Roger stood frozen, vacation ticket in hand. The once familiar street, the bus he had called home for 30 years, the crowd of familiar faces, all of it blurred as his heart pounded with emotion. He had spent his life following schedules, making sure others got where they needed to go. But now, for the first time, he had nowhere to be. Ding! The bus door chimed one last time, a gentle reminder of the life he was leaving behind. The crowd fell silent as Roger took a deep breath. Then, slowly, he smiled. "I guess I better start packing." A roar of applause, cheers, laughter. Tony Mosley, the transit supervisor, handed Roger a small, wrapped box. "We almost forgot this," he chuckled. "Something from all of us." Roger carefully unwrapped it, revealing a golden miniature bus engraved with his name and years of service. Roger Schwartz, 30 years of dedication. His fingers traced the letters as his throat tightened. He had never expected anything like this. To them, he wasn't just a bus driver, he was family. Chelsea Boyer, the single mother, smiled. "We'll miss you, Roger." Jenna Kahn, the artist, lifted her camera. "One last picture?" Sandy Mason, the coffee shop owner, held up a steaming cup. "One last coffee?" Roger chuckled, shaking his head. "I think I'll still need my morning coffee, but this time, maybe in Italy." Laughter erupted. The realization hit him. He was really going. "For the first time in years, I have no idea what's next, and I love it." Roger took one final look at his bus. The worn-out steering wheel, the scratched-up dashboard, the seat that molded perfectly to his form. It had all been a part of him. But now, it was time to say goodbye. With a deep breath, Roger handed the keys to Javier Bonner, the young mechanic. "Take care of her for me, will you?" Javier grinned. "She's in good hands." Roger turned to the crowd. Thank you, he said, his voice cracking. For every ride, every smile, every morning coffee, you all made this job the best thing in my life. A final round of applause, tears, smiles. And then, it was time. Roger took his first steps toward the unknown. No route, no schedule, just endless roads waiting to be explored.